Welcome to the Matt Cuda Photography Podcast, a podcast about nature and wildlife photography in your own backyard and throughout the United States. And welcome back to the podcast. This is episode 14, and over the next several weeks, I'm going to have a series of beginning wildlife photography episodes, because I know that there are folks out there that are new to wildlife photography and to photography itself. And so I want to start out with some basic topics such as exposure and lens selection and so on. So over probably the next 3 episodes, we're going to take a look at the importance of exposure, beginning technique, lens selection, etc. Okay, so exposure. Let's start with a simple working definition of exposure. And this is not a technical definition. This is just a definition that we can use and work with for the beginning photographer. So exposure is gathering the right amount of light in which to strike the sensor and give us a quality image. Let me repeat that. Exposure is gathering the right amount of light which will strike the sensor and give us a quality image. So, as photographers, how do we control this? It's one thing to say, yeah, we need so much light to make this exposure. That's kind of a nebulous concept at this point. Well, as it turns out, the camera has 3 controls to allow us to manipulate light. The first one is the shutter. Now, a shutter is a mechanical piece in your camera that opens and closes. Essentially, it controls the time the light strikes your sensor. For example, I might have a shutter speed of 1/125th of a second. That means for 1/125th of a second, light has been allowed to enter the camera and strike the sensor. It could be a 1-second exposure. It could be a 30-second exposure. So it deals with time. That's an important concept. The second way that your camera controls light is through the lens aperture. This controls the quantity of light. For example, think of an aperture as basically a hole in your lens. As I move the aperture to a higher number, that hole gets smaller. As I move to a lower number, or an f-stop, that hole gets larger, allowing more light to enter. So let's say f2.8 allows a great amount of light to enter. f22, a very small amount of light enters. The third type of mechanism that your camera has to control light is called ISO. ISO controls the sensor's light sensitivity. An ISO value of 100 is very slow. And so what it does is it takes a lot more light entering your camera to actually make that exposure. It's turned down the sensitivity. Another way to think of this is it's turned down the gain. That makes more sense to a lot of people in the electronic age. If I turn down the gain on something, I'm turning down the voltage that controls volume, for instance. So it's going to take more of a loud noise, for example. If I turn down the gain on a soundboard, it's going to take a whole lot more noise coming through that microphone to amplify. So that's kind of how the camera works. If I turn down the gain on the sensor or the ISO to 100, it takes a whole lot more light to get an exposure. Conversely, if I turn my ISO up to, say, 1600, 3200, 6400, now it takes a whole lot less light to influence the sensor. So manipulating these 3 controls will give you the exposure. And exposure is, again, gathering the right amount of light that the sensor needs to give us an exposure, or to give us a quality image. At this point in the game, if you're a beginner, what I'm going to tell you is this. ignore the ISO. What I'm going to do as a beginner, I recommend that you don't think about ISO. Set it at 400. Okay, we'll do like a Ronco commercial here. Set it and forget it. Set it at 400 and forget it. So I want to concentrate primarily on shutter and aperture because these two tools give us an incredible amount of control over light. And that's what creating a photograph is all about. It's all about light and shadow, the intensity of the light, the quality of the light. This is what we manipulate to primarily as an artistic representation of the scene. So these mechanisms, shutter and aperture, will do us absolutely no good without some way to give us a value to input into our camera, right? Back in the old days, we didn't have any way to tell us what our exposure was going to be. We had to guess. We had to have books that told us, in this condition, use this f-stop and this shutter speed as a starting point. Well, in today's world, and really in most of the 20th century, we have something called a light meter. And your camera has a light meter built into it. Simply stated, a light meter just measures the light and gives us a value to input into our camera, an f-stop and a shutter speed. There are three types of meters. There's the older center weighted average meter. What that does is it looks at the center of your image and gives you values based off reading that center. So let's say you had a picture of, let's just say you took a picture of one of your family members and you put them directly in the middle of your viewfinder. Essentially, because they're in the middle of your viewfinder, that center weighted averaging meter will probably work because they're filling up the whole middle of the frame. Okay, but what about complex situations? What about a situation where you have a great egret wading through the water and the dark ground is black? So you have a white bird on a black background. And maybe he's not in the center, but he's off center. What options do you have here? Well, as a beginner, I highly recommend that people use what's called evaluative or matrix metering. Essentially what this does, it divides the viewfinder up into zones and basically does a bunch of math to figure out the entire exposure. In the Nikon side, it actually has a database that it uses to determine what the exposure is going to be. Now, my problem with evaluative or matrix metering is simply this, that it can be fooled just like any other meter. Okay? You can still have some unique scenarios where it doesn't work. But generally speaking, this is where most people start, with the evaluative or matrix. Now, we didn't have this, when I first started with photography. We had center weighted averaging, and we had spot meters. And that brings me to the next type of meter, which is a spot meter. Most modern cameras have spot meters, which allow you to just take a small portion, a small circle of your image, and you can use that value to get your f-stop and your shutter speed. I will use spot meter quite often, actually, especially if it's a neutral gray scene that I need to meter. Just need to meter, the fur on a deer, for example, because I want to expose for the subject. And so I'll use that to get my exposure. So already we're into some pretty heavy stuff here. So if you're just starting out, this is all heavy technical stuff. And this is the part of the process that is technical. And you absolutely must get your head around this, because it is crucial to being a good photographer. And I don't necessarily mean a great photographer. I mean just to be a good photographer. It's crucial that you know these simple mechanical mechanisms of your camera and how to use them. So there's something I need to mention about camera's metering system. Your camera's metering system is trying to look at the scene in front of you it doesn't necessarily see color. What it's looking for is 18% gray. And 18% gray is a neutral tone. So it's trying to make everything this neutral tone because, generally speaking, that's what most things are. Green grass, for example, is a neutral tone. Blue sky is a neutral tone. The fur on an animal is fairly neutral as long as it's a brownish, grayish color. It's a neutral tone, fairly neutral. And so it's trying to average your scene out and create this 18% gray. That's important to understand because later on you're going to see where your meter can be fooled, and you need to know how to compensate for that. The other thing I want to tell you at this point is I want you to use manual mode on your camera. I know a lot of photographer teachers out there will start their photographers out with aperture priority or shutter priority. Just get that out of your head. Start with manual. If you can learn manual, you will master your camera. You'll never have to use aperture priority unless you want to, or shutter priority. You'll never have any fear that you don't understand exposure and how to meter a scene. I highly recommend manual mode on your camera. So let's talk about how to get that exposure, right? So we know now that we have a shutter, we have an aperture, we have ISO, and we have a meter that our camera uses to give us the values that we need. What are the steps to obtaining a meter reading? Now, some of you are going to think these steps are very, very simple, okay? But again, that's where I'm trying to reach here with this podcast. I want the beginner to be able to immediately use this information. And I'm going to give them a small template to use that, although it won't work for all situations, I think it'll work for the beginning photographer. So first of all, switch your camera to manual mode. Set your ISO to 400 ISO. 3. Point your camera at your subject and leave it there for the entire time you're metering. Now this is important. Okay. One of the problems that beginners have is they'll take their camera and they'll look through it at the scene to meter the scene, and then for some reason a lot of times they'll drop their camera down and have it pointing at the ground and try to make adjustments. Well, if your camera's pointing at the ground, it's no longer pointing at your subject, unless you happen to be shooting an amphibian or something. But let's say you've got a bird perched on a tree. You want to be pointed at that bird when you're getting your meter reading. Okay, you need to leave your camera there. The next thing I'm going to tell you to do, and this is where some of the advanced people are going to kind of raise their eyebrows, but trust me on this for a beginner. Open your lens aperture to its widest setting, the smallest number. Okay, so if it's an f4 lens, which it probably is if you're shooting a bird, or 5.6, or it's a 2.8 lens, open it up all the way to 2.8 or f4 or 5.6 and keep it there. Forget about it. Don't worry about touching it again. Just leave it there. Finally, move the shutter speed up and down. Well, first of all, as you're looking through your camera, probably to the right inside your viewfinder. This is how most DSLRs work. To the right in your viewfinder should be a green LCD display, and it looks something like just a couple lines that run from the top of your viewfinder to the bottom, and they're usually green, and they usually have little hash marks going all the way down and all the way up, and in the middle of that is 0. Okay, that's absolute just 0. And if you go down that, let's call it a tree. If you go down that tree, you're into a negative exposure. If you're going up the tree, past 0 and up, you're in a positive exposure. So as you go up, you're adding light. As you go down, you're subtracting light. That's how I want you to think of it right now. That tree can be read in what's called stops of light. So if I were to take that to +1 from 0, that is a +1 stop. If I were to take it to +2, that is a +2 stop. Conversely, if I were to take it from 0 to -1, that is -1 stop. If I were to take it from 0 to -2, that is -2 stops. In between are incremental changes. So for example, if I'm at 0, which 0 would be let's just say, quote, a perfect exposure. If I were to increase the exposure by one of those little hash marks, that's 1/3. So that's +1/3. So you can see how you can change your exposure based on shutter speed and aperture. But what I'm going to have you do is only use shutter speed. Now, why am I doing that? I want you to find your shutter speed dial. And I only want you to adjust shutter speed right now. I don't want you to worry about aperture. Aperture comes later. Think about shutter first. Why? Why do I say think about shutter? Because your shutter controls speed. Remember, it controls time. It controls how you can freeze the action of that critter you're photographing. Well, in my experience, 9 times out of 10, when someone says they have an out-of-focus image, what they really mean is the subject is blurry due to a shutter speed that's too long. So you're allowing too much light in, your subject is blurring. You need to learn to use as fast of a shutter speed as possible to stop action. Okay? What that means is, if I had a bird flying from left to right in my scene, I am going to want a shutter speed of about 1/1000th of a second or greater. Now, how do I know that? I know it from experience, okay? But those high shutter speeds from 1/500th to 1/1000th, 1/2000 to 1/8000 are fast speeds. It's a fraction of a second that has happened, that you're capturing that motion. And what happens is, it happens so fast that your subject can't move through the scene as your shutter is open. Okay, I know it's difficult. I know that this is some weird stuff to a lot of people, but trust me on this. You want a high shutter speed. You're going to be a lot happier when you first start out by using a high shutter speed. Your shutter is your friend in wildlife photography. Later on we can talk about aperture and how to control depth of field and all this. But right now, I don't even want to go down that road. I want you to understand that this is all about shutter. This is all about shutter speed. This is all about time, controlling time. So, we're on the last step here. I want you to move that shutter speed up and down until the needle or the little cursor, if you will, in your tree there, in your green tree to the right on your screen, is in the middle. So essentially it's at 0. Now in theory, or actually in reality, that is a properly exposed scene if it's at 0. But it assumes a lot. It assumes that you're metering a 18% gray scene. But for now, I want you to think of 0 as the correct exposure. Don't get tied up in exposing to the right and concepts like that. That's advanced concepts. Think of 0 as being my target on that Christmas tree. So what happens next? You go ahead and take a shot at this point. And you look at your viewfinder. Your LCD display. You look at it. Does it look dark? Does it look light? If it looks too dark, it's probably underexposed. If it looks too light, it's probably overexposed. And so what happens? If it's overexposed, if I've added too much light has gone through my shutter, I need to increase my shutter speed. So in order to do that, I'm going to move that shutter speed wheel, and probably what's going to happen is on your little tree there, you're going to be like -1 stop or -1/3 stop. Because you're decreasing. Remember, minus is decreasing. It's just common mathematics. Decreasing. If your scene looks too dark, then you're going to want to add more light. If you're adding more light, you're slowing down your shutter speed. So now you should be, let's just say our initial exposure at 0 was 1/2000th of a second. Now you're going to click your shutter speed value to 1/1000th of a second, giving you another stop of light. It's quite simple and the only way you can learn this, I can sit here and talk about it for 20 episodes, and you might kind of understand it. The only way you're going to understand this is if you go out with your camera. I don't care if it's your backyard, you want to go to the zoo, I don't care where you want to go. Go somewhere where you can mess around with shutter speed. Getting that proper exposure is one of the most important things you can do as a photographer. If you could have a shot of a horse running super fast, and you use the high shutter speed, but it's dark, you can't see any details, it looks muddy, you've blown your exposure. And now it's no good. It doesn't matter that it's a great image. It doesn't matter that you stopped this guy dead in his tracks by using the high shutter speed. If your exposure is not right, you've lost it. You've failed to create the image. And I know that so much of this is very nebulous and just hard to, just really hard to get your head around when you first start. But I'm telling you, it's just trial and error. You've got to do it. You've got to understand it, and you've got to use manual exposure. I know a lot of you guys out there are saying, "Oh, this guy's crazy." I'm telling you, until you can learn to use manual exposure properly, you don't know enough about your camera. Now, I'm not saying you have to stay with it forever. There are times that I use shutter priority or aperture priority. But 9 times out of 10, I'm using manual exposure because I know it's right, and I know it's set, and it's not going to change. Okay, so I wanted to look at some common scenarios. And before we leave the exposure, before we leave setting your exposure, let's talk about one more thing. There is something called a histogram. I don't want you to worry about that right now. Okay, I don't want you to worry about histogram. If you're an absolute beginner, do not worry about histogram. I'm not even going to talk about it today. It is a great tool. It is a tool you will learn to use. You don't have to use it. Okay, we didn't have histograms in the 1980s and 1990s when I was taking photographs. Okay, with film. Histograms didn't exist. There was no such thing as a histogram on our cameras. One thing that is a very valuable tool, though, and it's totally electronic. Yes, it was not around when I was shooting film. One thing that I really find useful is the highlight warning. Make sure that on your camera you have highlight warning turned on. It's also called Blinkies. If you look at the back of your LCD display when you have it turned on, if you overexpose, if you have too much light entering your camera and you overexpose, what you'll see is the whites in your image in the back of your LCD will actually blink. They'll actually blink. It's called the Blinkies. You'll hear people talk about it. What that means is you've blown out the highlights, or potentially blown out the highlights. If you're shooting JPEG, you have blown out the highlights. If you're shooting RAW, you may be able to recover those in post-processing. But for now, think of the Blinkies as bad. You want to decrease your exposure slightly until the Blinkies are gone. Now, some of you are probably sitting there thinking, I can't do all this. That bird's going to be gone. That horse is going to be gone. That deer is going to be gone before I do any of this stuff. That's why it's important to practice. That's why you've got to get out there. I don't care if you're shooting photographs of the family dog. Okay, you've got to learn how to control your camera. Your camera is a dumb piece of equipment. I don't care that you paid $5,000 and $6,000 for it. Without your genius, without your intervention, you will not create great images. You may get lucky once in a while. You may turn your camera on program, automatic. You might get lucky a few times, but you're not going to be able to consistently make photographs. You must, and I can't emphasize this enough, and I will not back down on this, you must learn your camera well. It has got to be an extension of you. It reminds me a lot of being a musician. Actually, I was a singer and guitar player for many years, and after a while, after you keep practicing and singing and playing guitar, you get that instrument becomes an extension of you. You know it so well, you hardly even have to think to play it. When I sing, I don't have to think. I just sing. It just happens. And that's how the camera is. The camera is, as I've said before in other podcasts, you and your camera are a synergy. Together, you create art. If one is missing, if you don't understand your camera, you're going to have a hard time making art. If you don't understand the creative process and creative energy, and you're lacking that, you're going to have a hard time creating art. So both of those together give you photography. You have to become a master of your camera. Okay, enough said about that. I'm off my soapbox. So let's continue on. What are some common, I want to leave you with some common tips here, because this whole thing may have gone right over your head. That's fine. Let me leave you some common tips, common wildlife exposure scenarios. The first one, a white animal on a black background. This is probably one of the most difficult and misunderstood scenarios that you will encounter. I encounter this. If you're in Florida, you will encounter this on a daily basis because you'll be photographing egrets. Egrets are primarily white, and they're almost always on a dark background. Because of that, you meter the bird. This is how I do it, okay? People have different ways of doing it. You meter the bird using a spot meter. Okay, now what's that going to do? Remember I said your meter's dumb. Your meter's stupid. It's going to try to take that bird you metered and turn him to 18% gray. Okay, what color is a bird? It's white. It's not 18% gray. So you're going to want to open up your exposure. So let's say you're at 0, right? You're at a 0 exposure on that bird. You've metered him, and it says, okay, that's f4 1/500th of a second. Okay? You think, oh, great, the right exposure. Click. You look at your viewfinder, everything looks very dark. It looks gray. The bird looks gray. Why? Because you must open up 1 to 2 stops for a white bird, even if you've got the right exposure in your camera. So we were at 1/500th of a second at f4. We are now going to open up to 1/125th of a second. Okay, I have increased my exposure by 2 stops. Go ahead and click it again. Look at the back of your camera. Make sure there's no blinkies. If there's any blinkies, decrease your exposure. At that point you're doing what's called bracketing. You're basically taking the exposure and you're moving the exposure one way or the other, darker or lighter, to try to give you a perfect exposure. Okay. Second scenario, the exact opposite. A black animal on a white background. Alright, similar situation. I got a black animal on a white background. If I spot meter that black animal, what's going to happen? Well, it's going to say, your camera's going to say, oh my goodness, he's trying to meter a black scene. Well, in order to make that the right exposure, your camera's saying, I'm going to have to open this baby up 2 or 3 stops. So that's exactly what it's going to do. It's going to open up 2 or 3 stops. And what's going to happen is you're going to actually get too much exposure, too much light entering your camera. So in this case, you need to close down a stop or 2. And only experimentation and the darkness of the animal, the brightness of the background, that's all that's going to determine your exposure. Okay? And the only way that you're going to understand it is practice. I can just sit here and tell you this is what you need to do. But until you get out there and you start experiencing it and you go, oh yeah, well, in this scenario, it wasn't quite 2 stops. It was only 1.5 stops. So you'll start to understand that under this condition, I need to use this setting. This is what the pros do. This is what the guys that go out there every day and do. They know, based on the scene, what their compensation is going to be. And remember, our compensation is anything greater or less than 0, because 0 is our, quote, perfect exposure. Okay, third scenario. Birds in flight on a blue sky. This is a very typical scenario that most people are going to run into when they're on vacation at the beach. You're going to have seagulls, seagulls is not the proper term. You're going to have gulls. It's funny, here's a little soapbox situation. For years, most people use the term seagull to describe any kind of gull at the beach. They did this because it was just a slang term. It was a common term, not necessarily slang, but a common term. Now, if you say that, you're going to get your head bit off by anybody near you that's a birder, because the correct term is gull, not seagull. Anyway, I digress. Back to the main point. You have a white gull on a blue background. What do I do in this scenario? Well, it's tricky. It's tricky because you can meter the blue sky. Okay, that's one way to do it. You can meter the blue sky. This is typically the way I'll do it. Go ahead, get a meter reading off the blue sky, and then I'll typically open up maybe a half stop and go ahead and try that. If that doesn't do it, I might open up a full stop. But generally, a blue sky is almost 18% gray. That's pretty much, my recommendation there. The final exposure scenario, and the tip that I have here, is also very typical. A brown bird in a tree. This is probably the easiest scenario you can be in. I simply spot meter the brown bird, and I fire away. Because a brown bird is pretty much an 18% gray. I mean, unless it's really, really dark brown. But most birds are kind of a rusty kind of color. It's a maybe a little bit darker gray than 18%, but it's going to get you close. You may have to open up a little bit or stop down a little bit depending on the scenario, but you're generally going to be happy with that. Again, we're talking about things that beginners can get their head around. So that's pretty much the common exposure scenarios. I hope that this episode, when I started thinking about this series I wanted to create, I was trying to create it based on what I thought a beginner might be able to understand. So I hope it's been a little bit helpful to you. If you have any questions, please feel free to drop me an email, matt.cuda@mattcuda.com. I'd be more than happy to answer your questions. I'm not an expert at all exposure scenarios. I have my ways I do things. I just hope it's been beneficial. And if it's not, let me know. If this is just way too complex for beginners, or it's just too difficult to do over audio, let me know. I won't spend any time on it. I'll move on to something else. But like I said, I thought I did some kind of some formal and informal polling recently, and one of the things that people said was they wanted to know more beginner topics, and so that's why I decided to go down this road. One more common scenario I forgot to mention, and I did want to talk about this before we move on. This is potentially one of the most difficult scenarios that you're ever going to be in, photographing birds in flight. And it's not an ideal scenario. Let's face it, we've all been out there when the sky was completely gray or bright white. How do you shoot a bird in a white sky? Well, there is one way that I know works, and I actually learned this from Arthur Morris. If you have a bright white sky and you're trying to photograph a bird, meter the sky. You say, what? Meter the sky? Well, that can't be right. Well, it's not really. If you were to meter the sky and you made your Christmas tree zero out, you would not have the correct exposure. You would have the correct exposure for the sky, but what would happen is the sky would get darker and the bird would get even more darker. So you'd have this dark blob in the sky, and you'd have this perfectly exposed sky. We don't want the sky exposed properly. We want our subject exposed properly, which is the bird. And so you meter the sky, you open up 2 to 3 stops. Simple formula, it works. Now, depending on the intensity of the sky, it might be brighter one day and darker the next. You'll need to fill around with that exposure sometimes, but that's a good rule of thumb, and it works. Okay, so what we've talked about today, just to recap, we've talked about what tools your camera has to determine exposure and set exposure. We've talked about common wildlife exposure scenarios. And I don't want to get any more in depth on this right now. This is designed to get somebody moving, get their appetite whetted, get them moving forward, making things simpler. But I do want to say one more thing before we move on to know your subject. I absolutely, again, encourage everyone, whether you're an intermediate, advanced, or a beginner, learn to use manual operation on your camera. It will give you confidence that you've never had. It will help you understand light better, how your camera sees light. And it's not a popular notion anymore. For some reason, manual exposure is not a popular notion, but a lot, and I mean a lot of advanced and pro photographers use it. People like Juan Pons, Martin Bailey, great photographers have used manual exposure. How about some of the greats like Ansel Adams? Ansel Adams didn't have anything called aperture priority. He had manual. He used manual, and he used it well. How about Bresson? You know, he was a guy that used all manual exposure. Anyway, that's it. I'm not going to talk about that anymore. I may actually delete all that I just put in there because it was so annoying. Okay, welcome to the Know Your Subject segment of the podcast. This is a segment that we do where we take one animal species, we discuss how that animal behaves, and how you can use this information to make you a better wildlife photographer. I truly believe that in order to be a better wildlife photographer, you must know the subject and know what to expect from the subject. The sound you just heard was that of the American bald eagle. I can think of no other bird that evokes so much emotion in the United States of America. It is our national bird. It is a bird which has a very strong look in its eye. It is a bird that has a very beautiful coloration, a white head. The white feathers on its head kind of fade into this strong brown color. They're just such a proud looking bird, and they're a bird that I absolutely think are probably the neatest raptors that I've ever seen. I mean, I just can't put into words how much I think of these birds. They're just fabulous. But let's see what the experts have to say. Cornell's Lab of Ornithology describes the bald eagle. The bald eagle dwarfs most other raptors, including the turkey vulture and the red-tailed hawk. It has a heavy body, large head, and long hooked bill. In flight, a bald eagle holds its broad wings flat like a board. The adult bald eagles have white heads and tails with dark brown bodies and wings. Their legs and bills are bright yellow. Immature birds have mostly dark heads and tails. Their brown wings and bodies are mottled with white in varying amounts. Young birds attain adult plumage in about 5 years. That was an interesting, the fact that it takes them 5 years to get the adult plumage was very surprising to me, actually. You'll find bald eagles soaring high in the sky, flapping low over treetops with slow wing beats, or perched in trees or on the ground. That's pretty much everywhere. Bald eagles scavenge many meals by harassing other birds or by eating carrion or garbage. They eat mainly fish, but also hunt mammals, gulls, and waterfowl. Okay, so that's the technical specs, if you will, on the American bald eagle. How do you photograph these? Well, I don't have a ton of experience, but I do have some experience, and I'll share with you what I know. Bald eagles in the eastern United States, which is where I primarily photograph, are quite skittish. They are very afraid. So much so that we've actually put regulations around viewing and best practices and so forth. Bald eagles, like many raptors, will go out hunting in the morning. And during the nesting season, they will hunt quite regularly to feed both themselves and their nestlings. This is a good time to photograph them, but it's also a time that I want to warn you about. Okay? If you come to America to photograph bald eagles, be prepared for rules and regulations. There are several laws that we have. Both federal and states have their own laws to protect these animals. You are not allowed to possess any part of an eagle. That includes a feather that you may have found on the ground. Generally speaking, you're not allowed to close within 350 feet of a nest. There are even some nests in Pennsylvania where you are not allowed to close within 1,000 feet. Now, those nests are just off limits. I mean, to be quite honest with you, you're not going to get a photograph from 1,000 feet away. Okay, that's like 300 yards. That's not going to happen. So, how then can you photograph them? Well, you don't have to be right on top of their nest to get good photographs, because, like I said, they're going to be going out fishing, hunting, so forth, grabbing their fish, and they're going to come back toward the nest. If you can position yourself in such a way that you are on their glide path for home, you will be able to photograph them in flight. Now, photographing them on the nest is a little bit trickier. The government, as well as I, suggest that you, first of all, I suggest that you get in camouflage from head to toe, and I suggest that you find a blind or a natural blind, or bring a blind with you, something that will conceal your movement, because bald eagles are very, very, at least on the eastern seaboard, are very, very skittish and afraid of people. And so you want to minimize your movement. You're going to want to bring tele-extenders for your lenses. You're probably not going to get extremely close. Okay, so you're going to want to have a 2x teleconverter on hand. You're going to want a 600 millimeter lens, and if possible, a crop sensor. I'm telling you, on the East Coast, it's difficult. Now, I know there's places on the East Coast where it's easier than others, but generally speaking, if you come up on a wild bird's nest, a wild eagle's nest, they're going to be very, very scared of you. They will flush from their nest, and if it's cold enough, potentially, if they're gone long enough and it's cold enough, you could cause their egg to not hatch. And so you got to be careful. There is within the law in the United States, there is a word called disturb. If you disturb a nest or disturb an eagle to the point where they are not sitting on their nest, you could be fined. So it's very serious here. It's a very serious situation. Really, in my opinion, more serious than, say, photographing an osprey or a hawk. It's much more serious to be photographing eagles. You must know the rules. That said, there are places that you can go that are a little more photography friendly. One place that I have not been to, but I've heard good things about, is Homer, Alaska. It's very, very expensive, but you can go. There are eagles in plenty, and you don't even need but a 200 or 300 millimeter lens. Anyway, Wow, that was a mouthful, but the eagles are tough to shoot in America, okay? I'll just be honest with you. There are some weird rules around it, and there's no shortage of people that are willing to turn you in if they feel like you're threatening one of these birds. I don't know if I agree with all the rules, but it doesn't matter because they're law, and so, I must abide by them. Well, sadly, that brings us to the close of another episode. Please send me your comments or questions to matt.cuda@mattcuda.com or tweet me at @mattcuda. I wanted to leave you with this quote by Ralph Waldo Emerson. Adopt the peace of nature. Her secret is patience. Thanks for listening. Make it a great day, and get out there and enjoy nature. Bye-bye. Music for this episode was provided by Dr. Turtle.